Of 2 state statutes, and you have still not identified yourself after I've asked several times. Okay, so get out of the vehicle. Come on, get out of the vehicle. Turn away from me. Turn away from me. Turn around. Hands behind your back. Interlock your hands like you're praying. Gotcha. Ma'am, fill this shit tight for me, okay? I'll come back and talk to you.
Stop begins the way thousands of routine traffic encounters begin every day. A vehicle pulled over in the rain, an officer approaching with administrative certainty, and a driver who does not respond in the expected rhythm. What separates this encounter from the countless others that end uneventfully is not the initial reason for the stop, but how quickly the interaction becomes a contest of authority rather than a process governed by law. From the first minute, the tone is set not by danger, but by impatience, by an officer who frames compliance as a personal test rather than a legal requirement, and a driver who does not speak in the language the officer expects. The officer opens with a declaration of control. The reasons for the stop are stated as settled facts, not topics for clarification. This matters because from the very beginning, the encounter is treated as closed-ended. The driver is not being invited into a lawful process. She is being told where the process will end. That framing removes flexibility before resistance even appears. When the officer asks whether the driver knew her license status, the question is not investigative, is confirmatory. The answer does not align with the script the officer anticipates, and the encounter begins to drift off course. What follows is the first critical shift. The officer asks for documents, and the driver responds with language that signals disengagement rather than refusal. She does not shout. She does not threaten. She does not attempt to flee. Instead, she speaks in a way that rejects the premise of the interaction itself. This is not uncommon in bodycam footage, but it is a stress test for officer training. At this moment, the law does not require emotional alignment or philosophical agreement. It requires clarity, patience, and procedural grounding. What it does not require is escalation. Yet escalation arrives almost immediately. The officer interprets non-standard speech as defiance. Instead of clarifying expectations, what must be produced, under what statute, and what will happen if it is not, the officer compresses the situation into a binary ultimatum. Identify yourself or be arrested. This is not delivered as a neutral explanation of legal obligation. It is delivered as a threat framed as an inevitability. The phraseology matters. When officers frame arrest as the officer's choice rather than the law's outcome, the encounter becomes personal. The officer is no longer enforcing statutes. He is enforcing obedience. This is where power dynamics quietly harden. The driver attempts to assert an identity that the officer does not recognize as legally valid. Whether that assertion has any merit under the law is beside the point at this stage. The critical issue is how the officer responds. Instead of acknowledging the assertion and redirecting to the lawful requirement name, license, or arrest, the officer treats the assertion as provocation. He begins counting chances. He characterizes himself as nice. This language is not procedural. It is emotional leverage. It suggests that lawful outcomes depend on the officer's mood, not on statutes. Once that framing takes hold, the encounter is no longer about compliance. It's about submission. The officer repeats the demand, but each repetition carries more impatience and less explanation. The legal threshold is already present. a traffic stop, alleged suspended license, and alleged equipment violation. Under these conditions, the officer does have authority to require identification, but authority exercised poorly erodes legitimacy. Instead of grounding his commands in clear statutory explanation, the officer leans on volume, repetition, and countdowns. This signals that the officer is losing confidence in persuasion and turning toward force. The turning point arrives when the officer orders the driver out of the vehicle. This is the moment selected for the opening hook, because it represents the irreversible shift from administrative stop to custodial encounter. Up until this moment, de-escalation was still possible. The officer could have paused, called a supervisor proactively, or calmly explained the arrest standard without theatrics. Instead, he accelerates. The commands become rapid. The physical choreography of arrest begins. The rein, the child in the vehicle. The presence of passengers, all of it, fades into the background as control becomes the primary objective. Importantly, the driver does not physically resist. She does not strike, flee, or pull away. The arrest proceeds with compliance. This matters because it reframes everything that follows. The justification for escalation cannot rest on officer safety in the moment of arrest. It rests entirely on perceived disrespect earlier in the encounter. That is a dangerous foundation for the use of state power. As the driver is secured, the officer's tone softens slightly, but only after control is achieved. This pattern appears repeatedly in problematic encounters. Once authority is physically asserted, politeness returns. This reveals something uncomfortable. The earlier hostility was not necessary for safety. It was a tool to compel obedience. When obedience is achieved, the tool is no longer needed. Then another layer of complexity emerges. The presence of a child. The child changes everything, legally and ethically. A routine traffic arrest becomes a family separation event. This raises immediate questions about discretion, proportionality, and planning. The officer now has a duty not only to enforce the law, but to minimize collateral harm. The bodycam captures a brief moment of logistical concern: who will take custody, who will move the vehicle, but that concern arrives late. By the time the child is discussed, the arrest decision is already locked in. The possibility of alternative outcome, citation, summons, delayed arrest, has passed. As other officers become involved, the encounter fragments. Information is exchanged piecemeal. The officer explains the situation in a way that frames the driver as uncooperative rather than confused or misinformed. This framing matters because it shapes how supervisors and additional units interpret the encounter. When the narrative is set early, she's refusing. She's not answering. It primes others to view any assertion of right as further defiance. At this stage, the officer introduces another form of leverage: the child's custody. The mere mention of Child Protective Services transforms the interaction from law enforcement to existential threat. Whether or not the officer intends coercion, the effect is the same. The driver perceives that her child's well-being is being used as pressure to force compliance. This is one of the most sensitive power imbalances an officer can invoke. Policy, in many jurisdictions, warns against using third-party consequences as leverage, precisely because it blurs the line between lawful enforcement and coercion. The officer's language here is especially important. He frames the involvement of child services as a consequence of the driver's choices. not as a decision requiring careful justification. This deflects responsibility while maintaining control. It suggests inevitability rather than discretion, even though discretion clearly exists. This rhetorical move shields the officer emotionally while intensifying pressure on the detained individual. As the interaction continues, the officer's demeanor oscillates between dismissive and confrontational. The driver's attempts to assert rights or challenge statements are met with sarcasm rather than clarification. The officer no longer appears interested in resolving the situation efficiently. Instead, the encounter becomes a stage for moral judgment. Words like behavior, attitude, and deserve enter the conversation. These are not legal terms. They are value judgments, and their presence signals that the officer has shifted from enforcing laws to evaluating character. This is a critical failure point. Law enforcement authority is at its strongest when it is impersonal. The moment enforcement becomes conditional on likability, the rule of law weakens. In this encounter, the officer repeatedly suggests that things could have gone easier if the driver had behaved differently. That framing retroactively justifies escalation while absolving the officer of responsibility for choosing it. By the end of this first phase, the encounter has fully transformed. What began as a traffic stop is now a custodial situation involving potential felony implications, child custody concerns, and interpersonal hostility. None of these outcomes were inevitable at the start. They are the product of accumulated decisions, small, often unexamined choices made under stress, ego, and impatience. And this is the central lesson of Part 1. Escalation is rarely the result of a single dramatic act. It is built moment by moment through tone, language, assumptions, and framing. Each missed opportunity for clarity becomes a justification for force. Each assertion of authority without explanation narrows the path back to de-escalation. By the time the officer steps away from the vehicle, the system is already in motion. Reports will be written. Charges will be filed. Narratives will harden. In the earliest moments, those quiet seconds where patience could have altered the outcome will be the easiest to overlook. Once the driver is secured and removed from the immediate scene, the encounter enters a new phase, one that often receives less public scrutiny but carries equal weight. Narrative consolidation. This is the stage where officers begin explaining what just happened, not to the detained person, but to each other. These explanations quietly determine how the incident will be understood, justified, and later defended. In bodycam footage, this phase is critical because it reveals how authority reframes its own actions. Once physical control has been established, the officer begins recounting the stop to other units in a manner that simplifies complexity. The driver is described as non-compliant, unresponsive, and refusing to identify herself. What is absent from this retelling is the ambiguity of her responses, the lack of clear statutory explanation early on, and the speed with which the encounter escalated. This is not unusual. In high-stress situations, humans compress events into narratives that justify their choices. But in policing, those narratives carry institutional consequences. This retelling immediately influences how other officers engage. They do not arrive to assess the situation independently. They arrive to manage a problem already defined. The driver is no longer a citizen involved in a traffic stop. She is a subject who has already failed a compliance test. This framing reduces the likelihood of de-escalation because the social cost of contradicting a colleague's assessment is high. Agreement becomes the default, not inquiry. As the officers begin sorting out logistics, the child becomes central to the scene. The presence of a child introduces an entirely different set of obligations, but here, those obligations appear secondary to maintaining control. The officer expresses uncertainty about what to do with the child, yet this uncertainty does not prompt a pause or supervisory intervention. Instead, it becomes another pressure point applied to the detained driver. The mention of Child Protective Services is especially revealing. It is framed as an administrative necessity rather than a discretionary choice. This framing matters because it masks agency. In reality, officers often have multiple options when a parent is detained. Contacting family, allowing another licensed adult to take custody, or delaying transport until arrangements are made. By presenting the most extreme option as the default, the officer shifts responsibility away from himself and onto the driver's earlier behavior. The driver reacts strongly to this. Her language becomes more urgent, more emotional. This reaction is predictable. Few threats carry more psychological weight than the potential loss of a child, even temporarily. From an analytical standpoint, this is where the power imbalance becomes stark. The officer controls not only the driver's freedom, but the immediate stability of her family. When this power is exercised without transparent explanation or evident necessity, it crosses from enforcement into coercion. The officer responds to the driver's distress, not with reassurance or clarity, but with dismissal. Her objections are characterized as disagreement rather than legitimate concern. When she uses legal language accusations of coercion, kidnapping, rights violations, the officer does not engage with the substance of those claims. Instead, he reframes them as emotional reactions stemming from her own choices. This is a subtle but powerful rhetorical move. It invalidates the speaker without addressing the argument. At this stage, the officer's demeanor grows increasingly personal. He comments on her attitude, her behavior, and her worthiness of consideration. These are not procedural assessments. They are moral judgments. The law does not grant officers authority to decide who deserves leniency based on temperament. When such language appears, it signals that the officer has internalized the encounter as a personal affront rather than a professional obligation. The conversation turns towards the driver's record. Labels like habitual enter the discussion. This is another turning point. Prior history, once known, often retroactively justifies escalation in the minds of officers. The logic becomes circular. The subject is treated harshly because they are considered a problem, and they are considered a problem because they are treated harshly. The initial encounter fades, replaced by an identity constructed through databases and past charges. What is important here is timing. The officer did not know these details at the outset of the stop, yet once discovered, they color every previous decision. The escalation now feels inevitable, even though it was not. This hindsight bias is dangerous because it discourages reflection. If the outcome was always going to be severe, then earlier missteps no longer matter. Accountability dissolves. The officer's interactions with the driver become increasingly sarcastic. He challenges her statements, mocks her assertions, and engages in verbal sparring that serves no investigative purpose. This behavior does not enhance officer safety. It does not clarify facts. It functions only to assert dominance. In bodycam analysis, this is often where professionalism erodes most visibly, not through force, but through tone, the presence of a physical barrier between officer and detainee emboldens this behavior. The risk is low, the power imbalance high. The officer controls when the conversation begins and ends. When the driver speaks, he interrupts or dismisses. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is structural. But professionalism demands restraint precisely because of this imbalance. When restraint disappears, the encounter shifts from enforcement to performance. The driver continues to assert that she has not been aggressive, that she has not resisted, that she has not raised her voice. Objectively, the footage supports much of this. Her resistance is ideological and verbal, not physical. Yet the officer continues to frame her as difficult. This highlights a recurring issue in policing, conflating nonconformity with threat. When citizens do not communicate in expected ways, officers may interpret that deviation as hostility, even in the absence of danger. As the interaction drags on, the officer articulates a familiar justification. Things would have gone much easier if the driver had simply complied. This statement appears in countless bodycam videos. It is rhetorically powerful because it shifts responsibility entirely onto the citizen. But it obscures an important truth. Ease is not the legal standard. Constitutionality is. The law does not require encounters to be easy for officers. It requires them to be lawful and reasonable. The officer's repeated emphasis on business. Language conducting business, refusing to do business reveals a transactional view of policing. In this framework, cooperation is currency. Those who pay it receive leniency. Those who do not are punished. This mindset undermines equal protection. Rights are not bargaining chips. They are guarantees that apply regardless of demeanor. The interaction becomes increasingly circular. The driver challenges the officer's interpretation of her behavior. The officer reiterates that her behavior is the problem. No new information is exchanged. No resolution is sought. This is stagnation disguised as control. In such moments, the encounter persists not because it must, but because neither party is allowed to disengage on equal terms. Eventually, logistical decisions are made. Who will take the vehicle? How the child will be handled? What charges will be pursued? These decisions are presented as settled, almost bureaucratic. The emotional intensity remains, but the outcome is no longer in question. This is another hallmark of escalation-driven encounters. Once momentum builds, stopping feels impossible, even when the original purpose of the stop has long been eclipsed. Part 2 exposes the machinery that operates after the initial flashpoint. It shows how authority consolidates itself through narrative, peer reinforcement, and moral judgment. The officer does not need to raise his voice or use force at this stage. The system does that for him. The driver's agency shrinks as procedures advance, each one justified by the last. What makes this phase so significant is that it rarely appears in official summaries. Reports focus on the stop, the arrest, the charges. They rarely capture the tone, the sarcasm, the dismissals, or the moments where discretion could have softened impact. Bodycam footage preserves these details, and in doing so, it challenges the sanitized versions of events that often follow. By the end of Part 2, the encounter is no longer volatile, it is entrenched. Positions are fixed. interpretations are hardened. The law is no longer being applied in real time. It is being prepared for retrospective defense. And the most consequential decisions, those that shaped everything that followed, are already behind us. In part 3, the focus will shift to aftermath and consequence. How charges crystallize, how outcomes diverge from initial justifications, and what this encounter reveals about the gap between authority exercised in the moment and accountability applied later. By the time the encounter reaches its final phase, the emotional intensity is dulled, but the consequences have hardened. This is where bodycam footage often becomes deceptively calm. Voices lower, movements slow. Paperwork replaces confrontation. Yet this calm is not resolution, it is finality. The decisions made earlier now crystallize into formal outcomes that will follow the driver long after the patrol cars leave the scene. At this stage, the officer's authority is no longer being asserted through commands or physical control, but through categorization. The driver is no longer a person reacting to a confusing start. She is an entry in a system. Labels matter here. Habitual traffic offender, resisting without violence. These terms carry legal weight far beyond the roadside, and once applied, they reshape how every subsequent authority figure will view the case. What is striking is how disconnected these final labels are from the initial moments of the stop. The early ambiguity, the lack of clear explanation, the rapid escalation, all of that disappears. In its place is a clean narrative: lawful stop, refusal to comply, arrest justified. The complexity of human interaction is flattened into boxes that can be checked. This is not necessarily malicious, it is procedural. But procedural, when insulated from reflection, can obscure accountability. The officer's later remarks reinforce this flattening. He frames the outcome as earned. The driver's prior record is treated as confirmation that the system worked as intended. This is a critical cognitive shortcut. When an outcome aligns with an officer's expectation of who a person is, the process that produced that outcome becomes less important. Errors, overreach, or missed opportunities for de-escalation fade into irrelevance. This is where hindsight bias becomes most dangerous. Knowing that the driver has prior offenses makes the escalation feel justified retroactively. But legality does not work backward. Each decision must stand on its own at the moment it is made. The fact that charges later stick or partially stick does not validate the tone, tactics, or discretion used earlier. Yet in practice, outcomes often become the only measure of correctness. The driver continues to push back verbally, even now. She articulates her perspective with increasing clarity, that she was not aggressive, that she did not resist physically, that she believed she was asserting rights rather than obstructing justice. Whether these beliefs are legally accurate is less important than how they are received. The officer does not meaningfully engage with them. Engagement would require acknowledging ambiguity, and ambiguity threatens authority. Instead, the officer reframes her continued speech as further evidence of attitude. This creates a self-sealing logic. Any attempt to explain becomes proof of the problem. Silence might be interpreted as compliance, but speeches, especially dissenting speeches, treated as aggravation. This dynamic places citizens in an impossible position: comply silently or be punished for speaking. The exchange also reveals a subtle shift in the officer's posture. With the situation under control, he allows himself to mock, to provoke, to test boundaries verbally. He challenges her statements, makes insinuations, and engages in rhetorical sparring. This behavior carries little risk now. The physical barrier protects him. The legal process is already underway. Yet this is precisely why it matters. Professionalism should not be contingent on risk level. If anything, it is easy to stand, most important to maintain when control is assured. As the conversation drifts, the officer's comments reveal an underlying belief that rights are tolerated rather than respected. He insists that rights are important, yet his conduct suggests irritation when they are asserted. This contradiction lies at the heart of many misuse of authority cases. Officers are trained to acknowledge rights abstractly, but in practice, rights that slow or complicate enforcement are often treated as obstacles rather than guardrails. The driver's repeated insistence that she was treated rudely is met with deflection. The officer reframes rudeness as justified response to non-compliance. This normalization of discourtesy is significant. Courtesy is not required by law, but it is a critical component of legitimacy. When officers dismiss concerns about tone, they underestimate how deeply tone affects public trust. Many encounters escalate not because of legal disagreement, but because of perceived disrespect. The discussion eventually circles back to logistics and paperwork. The vehicle will be handled. Custody decisions will be made. The system moves on. For the officer, this is the end of a shift segment. For the driver, it is the beginning of a legal process that will outlast the rain, the roadside, and the conversation itself. The final captioned outcome underscores this disparity. One charge is sustained, another is dropped. This outcome complicates the officer's earlier certainty. The most serious justification offered at the start of the stop the suspended license does not ultimately hold. Yet the arrest stands, supported by a secondary charge tied directly to the escalation itself. This is a pattern seen repeatedly in contested stops. When the original basis weakens, resistance-based charges fill the gap. This raises an uncomfortable question, not about legality, but about causation. Would the resisting charge exist without the escalation? If the encounter had remained procedural, would resistance have occurred at all? In many cases, resistance without violence emerges not from an intent to obstruct, but from confusion, fear, or disagreement amplified by aggressive enforcement. The law permits such charges, but their prevalence invites scrutiny. The footage also reveals how accountability is fragmented. No single moment appears egregious in isolation. No dramatic abuse of force occurs. This makes the encounter easy to dismiss as routine. But misuse of authority does not always announce itself loudly. Often, it operates through accumulation. Repeated impatience, dismissive language, unnecessary ultimatums, and the leveraging of power imbalances. Institutionally, this type of encounter rarely triggers correction. The officer followed procedure in the narrowest sense. A stop was made. Commands were given. An arrest occurred. Paperwork was completed. The deeper issue stone, escalation. Choices, discretionary leverage, exist in the gray space that policy struggles to regulate. This is why bodycam analysis is so important. It captures what policy language cannot. From a systems perspective, the encounter illustrates how training gaps persist. Officers are taught legal thresholds, but not always escalation psychology. They are trained to command, but not always to listen. When citizens deviate from expected behavior, officers may lack tools other than force or arrest to regain control. This creates a narrow funnel: compliance or custody. The presence of the child adds a final layer of consequence. Even if custody is resolved without long-term separation, the experience itself is traumatic. The child witnesses a parent being restrained, argued over, and threatened with removal. These effects do not appear in police reports, but they ripple outward. They shape how communities perceive law enforcement, not as protectors, but as unpredictable. Authorities whose actions can upend lives over moments of disagreement. In the end, the encounter resolves not with clarity, but with exhaustion. The driver's voice fades. The officer disengages. The camera keeps recording, indifferent to who feels vindicated and who feels wronged. This indifference is the most honest element of the footage. The camera does not take sides. It simply preserves choices. And those choices, taken together, tell a story larger than any single stop. They reveal how quickly authority can harden, how easily discretion can become coercion, and how systems built to enforce law can drift toward enforcing obedience instead. They show that misuse of authority is rarely about villains, and victimization is about habits, incentives, and unexamined power. This is why encounters like this matter, not because they are extreme, but because they are ordinary. They occur in the space where professionalism is tested, not by danger, but by disagreement. They challenge institutions to ask not only whether officers can enforce the law, but whether they can do so without letting ego, impatience, or narrative convenience shape outcomes. By the time the footage ends, the rain has stopped being relevant. The traffic violation has long ceased to matter. What remains is a record of how authority was exercised when it was questioned, and how little room the system leaves for questioning authority without consequence.